Hello, so this part of the video is going to look at change over time, how things change when the crimes are happening. Please apologise, this little scratch. I got attacked by Lyra Cat last night because she is sassy. So we're just going to kind of use this timeline to look at how crime changes and continues over time. So you're probably going to want a ruler for this. You've got your time periods here. Got medieval, early modern, industrial, and 20th century. Now, one crime that continues throughout our entire time period is petty crime, or petty theft, apologies. And this is always the most common crime. And it's always the most common crime because it's one with least punishment, and people throughout time are always either desperate or need something to survive, so they will steal for it. Another crime that continues throughout the time periods is homicide. Although we know in the medieval period it was particularly high at 18.2%. And if you want to go back and look at why that was particularly high, go to the medieval crime revision. So one crime that we've got happening in the medieval period and continuing into parts of the early modern period is heresy. It's the crime of spreading false religious beliefs, and that goes up to about 1600. Another crime that we've got is the emergence of vagrancy after the Black Death. And that goes into the early modern period. And that's wandering around to find work. So that's after the Black Death, which is in 1348. The crime of treason, that starts in the medieval period, and that goes all the way up to the 20th century. Now, vagrancy is a crime up until 1601, when it's the begging. If you remember from the Elizabethan Poor Law, it's begging that then becomes the crime in 1601. Now, the early modern period is where we get a lot of new crimes occurring. Witchcraft has been a crime since the medieval period, but it really increases in the early modern period. And it actually doesn't stop being an actual defined crime until the 20th century. But if you're going to write about witchcraft, this one's treason, apologies. If you're going to write about witchcraft, it's in the early modern period where there is a huge increase. You also get the emergence of other new crimes in the early modern period. For example, things like smuggling. And this continues right the way up to modern day. There's also lots of new crimes that emerge in the 20th century. So you've got things like car crime, drug crime, and race crimes. This would be really useful for when you are revising how crimes change over time when the different crimes stop. So what we're going to look at in this video is the changes to law enforcement over time. Again, just a reminder of those time periods. We've got 1250 to 1500, which is the medieval, early modern, which is 1500 to 1750, industrial, which is 1750 to 1900, and then after that you've got the 20th century. So we'll start in the medieval period, and the one that everyone seems to remember is the hue and cry. If you can't remember what that is, go back to the law enforcement video for the medieval time period, and that is in the medieval time period and continues into the early modern period. You also have in the early modern period tithings, and these seem to fade out within the early modern period. Another key role that starts in the early modern period is the sheriff. Now, the sheriff does continue into the early modern period, but he starts to fade out, and that is due to the introduction of the JPs. Let's try and focus that a bit better. There we go. So the JP is introduced within the medieval period to take over the court duties of the sheriff, and they continue even today in the role of magistrates. So we've got JPs. They gain importance in the early modern period, and we still have them today in the role of magistrates. Another thing that starts in the early modern period is in the medieval period is watchmen, and they continue until the 1780s. Watchmen. Their numbers increase in the early modern period. You then also have roles such as the constable, that again lasts for about the same time as watchmen. You've got parish constables, chief constables of the 100. In the industrial period is where we start to see a lot of new law enforcers being introduced. So, for example, we have the introduction of the Bow Street Runners, and they stay within the industrial period because they are succeeded by the Metropolitan Police Force, which continues today. And they start in 1829. Now, as you know, law enforcement is made up of policing and the courts. So at the bottom, we'll include the changes over time of the court. So we'll go from courts that deal with the most serious crime. So we have the Royal Court, and that is actually ended in the medieval period and is replaced by the county assizes, which lasts all the way up to the 20th century. And that court tries the most serious crimes. Within the medieval period, we also have the 100 Court, and that's where the sheriff would oversee any crimes, but then that is taken over by the quarter sessions. Which becomes like a magistrate's court in the industrial period. And they try lesser crimes. There is also the Crown Court, the Church Court, and that tries church crimes or priests. And you see that decline towards the end of the medieval period. Another one that we have is the Manor Court. And the Manor Court, that starts to decline at the end of the medieval period. If you have any kind of questions or anything about any of these courts, make sure you go back to the law enforcement sections of the crime and punishment content video. I'm just going to switch this over and we're going to have a look at punishments. So there are different types of punishments, but there are also different purposes of punishments, okay? One purpose of punishment is removal, and that removes the criminal from society, and that has continued and been used through all time periods. So, for example, either by execution or by imprisonment. What we also get is retribution. So criminals paying for their crime. And maybe giving some payback to society. The big change within this is the focus of deterring people, so deterrence from doing a crime. And that lasts very much from the medieval period into the industrial period, so making punishments quite harsh. For example, increased bloody code in the early modern period. But then that changes very much to reform in the 20th century. So helping criminals change so they no longer commit crime. One punishment that has continued throughout all time periods is a fine. Another one that continues throughout all time periods is execution. But this actually ends in the 20th century in 1965/69 when it's formally fully ended. It was a trial in 1965. A common punishment up until the early part of the 20th century, when corporal punishment was removed, is whipping. Another form of kind of corporal punishment or humiliation, you've got stocks and pillories, and they continue into the industrial period. You do have the emergence of different forms of corporal punishment, for example, like the ducking stool, which emerges in the early modern period, and I think probably just end it in the early modern period because we don't hear about it again after that, and also Scold's Bridle. In the early modern period, there is the introduction of bridewells for vagrants. Now, these continue into the industrial period, but actually become poorhouses, so a way to house the poor. So they're not actually a punishment into the 20th century. They're more of a support. So leave them out in the industrial in the early 20th century. It's very much bridewells to deal with vagrants in the early modern period. There's also the introduction of transportation. Now, it does start in the early modern period, but it's most common in the industrial period. And then you could also think about the introduction of the bloody code, so a huge increase in the amount of capital crimes, and that's actually reduced in the industrial period. I hope you found these timelines useful. The next video will be all about question annotation.